I actually grew up in Norwich, so it's really nice to be home, but I'm now based in London with the firm in East London. I used to work in-house doing legal and biz dev roles for both King Games and Disney Interactive, so I know what it's like to work for kind of big games companies on top of that. Also a gamer, of course. I predominantly play on PC, but PS4 does also steal some of my time away as well. And that's my Twitter. So these are some of the studios that we work for, right the way up to kind of like very big, like hundreds and hundreds of people, independent studios like CDPR who make the Witcher series, all the way down to kind of 2-3 man outfits like Bithell Games and Crows down on the bottom right. So probably about half our client base are based in the UK and 50% in other areas of the EU. So as I said, big clients and small clients, and we do a whole range of work for them, so including contracts, but IP, disputes, consumer law, all that kind of stuff. So pretty much anything, hopefully, that a game company or studio would ever need from legal or business or ops side, we can help them with. So basic starting point, why do you need contracts? Always good to start here because it's honestly worth explaining most of the time. So of course, nobody really gets into games to do contracts. You guys make games, you're creative. Obviously, there are people like me who do actually want to do games contracts, but we are few and far between. But at the end of the day, you're running a business, and hopefully you'll make a game or make multiple games that will be huge successes, runaway businesses, and you can build great studios on the back of that. So important ones include publishing contracts, contractor and employment agreements. The focus of this talk today will mainly be publishing agreements with some contractor stuff thrown in, primarily because publishing agreements are, of course, like the bread and butter of getting your game out there, and they tend to be the longest, the most complex, and just the ones that we get asked about the most. And it's really important in terms of contracts of having that paper trail, whether it's for disputes later down the line or knowing what the obligations of each party. It's common sense from that perspective. Before you get into any contract negotiation, give yourself enough time. Some contracts can be very, very quick and easy to negotiate. And 2 next points, make sure everything is in the contract that you agree and that you negotiate. The amount of times that people say to us, but we had it in the email, doesn't count because there's a little legal line at the end of every contract that says if it's not in the agreement, then it doesn't count. So really important to remember that. Even if you've agreed it over a pint or over an email, it has to be written in the contract. And be prepared to walk away. That's kind of links back to the first point about giving yourself enough time, but the amount of times people just end up signing agreements just because they don't have enough time to go anywhere else, it happens more than it should. And I know that can be also really difficult to achieve every time, but it's something to always try and think about. So the 5 areas I'm going to cover today, I've kind of broken them up into different areas for the 5 tips. So financials, seems obvious, important to know money and when and where it's getting paid. Intellectual property, this makes up the kind of main body of my talk, I would say, just because it is the kind of the soul of your game. Milestones and how to approach milestones and delivering different points of the game. Termination, of course, really important to know how you're going to get out. And of course, a little bit on the legal stuff at the back end. So, financials, how much you're getting paid and when. This seems basic, but this is important for both publisher and contractor agreements. It's important to know what you're paying when, but also what you're going to have to pay somebody else when. And cash flow is one of the biggest problems that we have found with game studios. People not knowing what money they need on a month-to-month basis are then falling behind on other areas, whether it's milestones or paying employees or contractors, just because they haven't looked at their business as a whole and worked out when they're going to need the money, essentially. And quite often with publisher agreements, you won't get money on day one. Just because your game's been released, it takes a long time for the money to filter down to you. Can sometimes take 3 to 6 months. So for publishing deals in particular, looking at the revenue split is of course vital. It's basically where all your money's going to flow in from. And the way that is normally phrased in contracts is a lot of it's through the definitions. And people can sometimes ignore the definitions because there's a big long list of them at the front of contracts. But if anyone's going to try and be sneaky in a contract, they normally try and sneak it in the definitions. So it's really interesting to look at how things like deductibles are defined, how gross revenue is defined, how net revenue is defined, just to work out exactly what's getting taken off at what point and what this means will filter down to you when it finally lands in your pocket. And then These 2 points here are really important. Who pays the taxes and how do refunds get dealt with? Refunds tend to get normally dealt with by the publisher, but it also is really important to look at timings. Once they process a refund, when does that come off? At what point? It can be, maybe it's the same month, maybe it takes a while to go through. So again, those kind of issues can come into play when it filters down, as I said, to net revenue. And taxes, of course, is a big one. I'd say it's mostly an issue where you've got a developer and a publisher in different countries. As soon as you've got differing tax rules, it's really important to get somebody who basically knows about tax to have a look at it. This is an interesting kind of very game-specific point, but who decides the price of the game? A very common thing nowadays is to have kind of Steam day one sales. So games get released on Steam with a 20% discount just to kind of, get them onto the top of the front of the Steam page, but also to encourage people to buy in the first few days. Now, that's great if you've agreed to it and if you've agreed to a price, but you don't want to give a publisher free wheel just to decide how much you can discount the game and when. Similar things with bundles, like companies like Humble Bundle do a great job of bringing games to the fore and distributing to them a lot of people, but it can mean a hit to your pocket. So you need to know and have some control over that. Royalty reports. The only thing I'll say about royalty reports is try and see one that is produced by the publisher before you sign, because they can be really unwieldy documents and you need to know them and understand them and ask questions before the first one actually lands on your desk and you're just looking at it and you don't know what it says. So ask questions. So on to IP. So this, as I said, this is the kind of the bump of the talk just because it is so important. For anyone who isn't familiar, although I'm sure you are, intellectual property is essentially the core of your game. So it's your graphics, your writing, your code, your music, all of the different constituent creative parts that make up your whole game. And that's obviously, as I said, the soul of your game. It's what you're essentially going to be publishing. So on the contractor point, you need to make sure that you either own everything, the studio owns all the IP in the game, or at least has very strong licenses. Clearly, we would try and own everything, which if you're bringing in contractors and paying them, you'd want that in the contract. Also, side note, do not assume just because you're paying somebody to do work for you doesn't mean you own it. That is a number one misunderstanding, I think, by game developers. They go, oh, I've paid someone to do the work. Doesn't mean you own it. You need to have something written in writing that shows that that creative IP has been transferred to you. Does anyone know who this is on the right? Thank you. Do you know why I've put him up here?
Because recently they had to take it off the Steam store because of the music licensing issues.
Spot on. So as I said, solid licenses. So as this man just correctly said, Alan Wake only had music licenses for 7 years, so it had to be pulled off all retail or digital stores last month. And Remedy, who made the game, just have said, well, we might renegotiate the licenses in the future, but at the end of the day, they're making a new game, so it's not really at the top of their list. And I don't think the publishers are probably going to be focusing on it either, But it's a shame because, it's a classic game and it's been pulled off the stores indefinitely. Music licensing, as a side note, isn't always an area of massive issues just because the music law industry is very old school, so they're very protective over their own IP. As I've said, it's also a big area of video game disputes. We are currently representing a small indie developer who has, I think there's 3 in the team, and they've made a game that's now sold for millions, and one of their ex-contractors is now suing them for a massive chunk of the profits because, guess what, they can't find the contractor agreement that they signed with him originally that paid him for the work, and now he's going, I want a slice of that pie. So if you take one thing away from this whole talk, I would say please make sure you actually own the work that you're planning to sell and you've got a paper trail for that. So for publishing agreements, I think people quite often ask how you should deal with IP in terms of dealing with the publisher. There's definitely a sense in the development community that you should never give away your IP, and I would say 99% of the time you probably don't need to, but there are still very small times that you might still consider doing it. So if you're keeping your IP, there's still stuff to watch out for. You need to watch out for the license wording that you're essentially allowing the publisher to publish your game. Because quite often, again, they will try and sneak in things that they can also do with the game. Not necessarily bad things. They might say they can also market it. They're also going to, promote it on their website. They're going to do PR for it. All great stuff, and that works in your favour. But you need to make sure that you're not giving away more than you mean to. You need to understand the full license. Again, watch out for definitions of words like game. This has happened a couple of times with clients that we've taken on, then we've gone and looked through their contracts. They've accidentally not given away just the game that they were working on, but DLC, sister titles, sequels, the whole load of it. So you need to be careful that you're not just giving away future works as well, because you may well want to work with that publisher in the future, but you don't want to unwittingly do it beforehand. And then you have to check other clauses in tandem with that license as well. So check on things like exclusivity wording, territories. Territories is really important because quite often people feel like giving a worldwide license is great because they can sell your game anywhere. But if you want to get into a country like China, you are 99% of the time going to want a very specialized Chinese-based publisher because the regulatory and economic framework in China is so difficult. So again, be careful what you're giving away rights to. It's even as easy as saying something like, worldwide excluding certain countries if there's just certain countries that you think you're going to want to go out by yourself. So as I said, China is like number one example. So giving up your IP, as I said, this can be very controversial because some developers truly believe that you should never give up your IP. But as a lawyer, we have to kind of give, obviously, multiple sides and give all our clients like all the possible options that could benefit them. And there's never kind of one default publishing agreement full stop. There's so many different moving parts that they can be so different from client to client. But these are some of the factors that have come into play before for people giving up their IP. So it's a very well-known publisher. They've got really solid marketing commitment. They may be getting a crazy good rev share. Getting a huge amount of money up front can often be a big input because if the publisher is saying we're giving you millions and millions of pounds, then we're going to want to be able to own that game. Another good example of a recent client that we represented, their logic for giving up their IP is that it wasn't their main franchise. They just weren't invested in it. They weren't planning to do anything else with it. And they got a boatload of money off the back of it that then they could actually use on their actual passion project and what they really wanted to work on for 3 to 5 years. So they were quite happy to go, okay, we'll take a load of money and just hand this game over to the platform. And if you are giving it up, I've got 2 top tips. Request a right of first offer. This essentially means that if the publisher owns the IP, they have to come to you first if they want to develop a sequel. So they come to you, they say, we'd like to do a sequel of this game. You can say yes, and then they have to give it to you, or you can say no, and then only at that point can they take it to another studio. So great little mechanic there that just means that they have to come to you first and that you still have some control over what happens in the future. Another big one that's becoming more and more important, a reversionary right, which means if the publisher owns your IP but does absolutely nothing with it for normally, we say 3 to 5 years, the IP then reverts back to you. Does anyone know what this game is called? Spot on. So this is a spy game. I think it came out in the early 2000s, maybe even slightly earlier. But a studio called Night Dive, who specialises in bringing back old IP for games that have been long lost, spent a couple of years, I think in 2015, trying to bring this game back. But a combination of the studio that made the game being bought and just generally the rights being very scattered, they came up against loggerheads with 3 major publishers who just wouldn't help them to try and locate where the rights were, and to the point where one of the big publishers just sent them a cease and desist when they tried to file a trademark. So they've since abandoned trying to get the game to come back to life. But I expect over the next few years in particular, we'll see more of this kind of thing happening, of games being stuck in publisher warehouses, wasting away, nothing can happen to them because publishers are too busy making Call of Duty 800. They don't want to bring back the old classics. Ancillary rights, this is just a bit of kind of bonus IP slide. It doesn't really fit in with the other 2, but I still think it is important because this is the sort of thing that developers can very quickly give away, but when things become very successful, they kind of look back at their contract and go, oh, I've given away everything else aside from my game. So it really can limit your ability to make merchandise or obviously make a film is a very extreme version of that, but quite often people want to make T-shirts or posters or, little, gaming skins for their controllers and stuff. So really important to look out, not only for your game IP, but everything else as well. You might be happy to sign that over to the publisher, and the publisher might have a really good track record of dealing with this kind of stuff really well, particularly the bigger ones can have quite a lot of financial backing, but there's no guarantee. Again, they could just sit on their laurels and never take the opportunity. We're living in a world of franchise building. And even though I'm sure predominantly here this is indie developers, I'm sure like a lot of your studios have Twitter accounts, have YouTube channels. It's all about, you know, being on different platforms and reaching out to users in different ways. I think a really good example is Stardew Valley. You know, it's an indie game made by one guy, but even he's got like a full-blown online shop with T-shirts, plushies, posters, these little custom maps. So even though he's probably not going to be in a rush to make a Stardew Valley TV show anytime soon, there's still other ways that he's bringing in money and engaging with his fan base. So again, as I said before, definitions. Watch out for words like media rights. What does that include? Because publishers have a tendency just to throw everything in with the kitchen sink, and it gives them a whole, basically broad range of rights to do what they want with media rights, and as I said on the previous slide, or not do anything with the additional media rights. So next section, this is tip 3. So this is milestones and acceptance testing. This is something that I think in legal contracts has grown a lot in the last few years. Historically, game specifications used to be a lot bigger thing where you would just have one page at the back of a contract and says, this is what the game's going to be. Whereas now it tends to be a lot more broken down and people tend to detail things at every milestone a lot better. And I think that is helpful for everybody because it gives the developers a better structure to build up, essentially. So key point, obviously, is what do you have to do by when and how does that link to payment? As I said earlier, cash flow can be a big problem for developers, so maybe consider asking for an advance at this stage if you think you're going to need some more developer funding up front, or even just making the first couple of milestones the slightly bigger payments. So wait, maybe the first 2 payments a bit bigger, and then the later payments maybe get smaller. And that's a really good way of just dealing with potential money issues if you're having to pay contractors or your employees, etc. Milestones. So as I said, what constitutes an alpha? What constitutes a beta? Is it, you know, no material bugs, fully localized, text, or full, voiceover done? You can put a whole range of things in here, but just having a description that you can really hang on to, and if the publisher says you haven't done it, but you have, you've got something there in writing that says exactly what each of these stages constitute. Consider a material changes clause in case, something horrible happens at the studio, or you happen to be going ahead of time maybe, that you've got a bit of flexibility to renegotiate it very slightly. You can even put the framework of what happens if you fall behind in there, so it's all covered in the contract. Again, a little bit more complex, but it can be really useful. How is work approved is also really important. One thing we always look out for is to make sure that the publisher doesn't have an immediate right of termination if you happen to get one milestone wrong. You have to have 2 or 3 opportunities to correct it. So normally what happens is you submit the work, you're given maybe 5 to 10 days, they're given, 5 to 10 days to check the work. If it's all good, you submit the invoice, get paid, all's good. If they don't, they have to send it back to you and you get 2 or 3 times to, retry it and get it to meet that standard that they expect. Termination, so point 4. So termination is an interesting one. Obviously, people don't want to think about when a contract's ending just as when it begins, but it is super important to look at how you can possibly get out if things go bad, but it's just important to know what the publisher can do from their perspective to you. So, basic point, how long does the contract actually last? I've seen quite recently some publishers putting down 20 to 30 year terms, which seems quite excessive. So again, interesting to know how long your game is going to be under this publisher, full stop. So that's obviously the first point to look for. How can you terminate and how can the publisher terminate? So quite often in publisher agreements, the publisher is going to have a lot more rights to terminate than you will. And that's completely standard, to be honest, and it can be very difficult to get a publisher to shift on that. Just because it's normally one of the things they like to standardize across all their, all the developers that they're working with. When can you terminate, obviously, is very important. So you need to know if you can terminate for material breach is very important. So if the publisher obviously does something so heinous under the contract that you need to get out of it, you need to be able to get out of it. Something called a termination for convenience tends not to be so freely available in these contracts, which basically means I just want to terminate on 30 days written notice, just because there's often so much money behind these deals and so much planning, and there's all the possible services that the publisher might be giving to you, like QA, localization, marketing, that they've had to account for. it's generally not seen as something that they quite often put in the contract. But on the flip side, for a contractor agreement, you might want to put a 30-day or 14-day termination for convenience right just for you as the studio, in case you decide, actually, we don't need this at this point, or we don't need your services anymore. Harsh as it is, that's why you at least try and have a little bit of a notice period. What happens to the game IP when the contract ends is super important to look out for. Not only is looking at the termination rights itself really important, but it's also important to look at the effects of the termination. So what happens to your IP? Key point for them from earlier is if they're keeping your IP, but they terminate because of their breach, or you terminate because of their breach, then they should not be able to keep hold of the IP if it's their fault. And that's probably like one of the worst things that can happen is somebody signs over their IP, the publisher's terrible, you terminate the contract, and then you realise that if you do terminate, the IP stays with them. So that stops you from continuing to develop the game, taking it to another publisher. It's just all locked up with them. So please do look out for that, because that's really difficult. Payments is also really important as well. So for example, like we were saying last time with Milestones, if you terminate or if they terminate, do you maybe get paid for the next milestone or the milestone you're doing? Quite often good to negotiate that if you want a bit of extra cash flow coming in the assurance that if it's their fault, then you still get some money coming in. Also really key is, do you have to repay any development funding? One of the points I was making earlier about cash flow is quite often the reason that money doesn't come in very quickly for developers once they release their game is quite often the publisher is recouping all their development funding before you even get paid. This is an even more kind of extreme version of that of, okay, we terminate the contract, hand me back the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of pounds in development money that I've given you. So really watch out for that. We generally try, particularly if it's the publisher's fault, that's a no-go. You don't pay it back and you get the IP back. The example I've put on the right here is a bit of an extreme example, but MGA, who own Bratz, had a licensing deal with Ubisoft, and Ubisoft are making Bratz games, as you can see there. And Bratz got really popular, so they decided to pull a bit of a fast one on Ubisoft and terminate the contract in order to try and renegotiate themselves a better deal. Of course, when renegotiations failed, they were then sued. MGA tried to sue Ubisoft. Ubisoft went hard back and managed to win 13.2 million on them. So don't terminate your contract lightly just to try and get a better deal. Try and obviously get it right the first time, and don't pull a fast one like these guys did, because it can end pretty badly. I think that was about 10 years ago now as well. So if a similar thing happened today, it would probably be for even more money. So point 5, the legal stuff. My favourite dodgy lawyer on the left there, Ken Rosenberg from Grand Theft Auto Vice City. So obviously this is normally a lawyer's job to take care of this stuff for you, but even having someone with legal or biz dev experience will also be really helpful in this area. Ideally, your lawyer will also take you through the front end, which is all the stuff we've been talking about, i.e. the deal terms, the good things, the money, the IP, all going really well. And then they'll also take you through the back end. And the back end legal stuff does tend to be the when stuff goes wrong stuff. And it's not particularly fun to negotiate, but at the same time, you have to protect yourself, you have to protect your game. So one thing that I always get asked about is indemnities, just because it's one of those kind of weird legal words that no one's ever really sure what it means. And the way I try and describe it to people is it's a promise to compensate the other side for a specific loss. So quite often a common one that you would see, and I think one that's completely normal to see in a publishing agreement, is if one side infringes another person's intellectual property and the other side gets in trouble for it, you have to cover for it. And that's normally mutual, so that's two-way. So if the publisher for some reason infringes someone else's IP and you get in trouble for it, the publisher has to cover for you. So that's completely normal to see. Another really common indemnity to see is breach of confidentiality. So if the other side breaches confidentiality and that causes you a massive loss, they have to pay for that. But again, that's the sort of wording that someone with a bit of business or legal experience should be checking, because it's one of those areas that quite often the publisher will give themselves all the protection and all the coverage at this point and not necessarily give you the same back, which most of the time it really should be. Whoops, wrong way. Warranties is another classic legal word that always pops up. And the way, again, I would describe this is a promise that something is true or is fact. So quite often you see warranties that you own the game, which is very key given all the stuff we've seen before. You have to know that you own the game, because quite often you will have undertaken a legal promise that you do in fact own the game, and the publisher will have a right of action against you if it transpires that you get into trouble later down the line. Another common one you see is just that you both have the power to enter this agreement, or that nothing else will stop you from entering this agreement. So, for example, if I've already signed an exclusive publishing deal with another publisher and I then sign another one, it will make me promise in that contract that I've not signed another agreement that will basically bar me from doing that, and you could get into trouble. Seems obvious, but sometimes people do kind of get themselves in a tiz over warranties and promises that they have to make. Governing law jurisdiction. I think this is one that people tend to look over quite a lot, but it's actually quite important. Actually, I think it's something like 40% of commercial contracts are actually governed by English law, which is really good for us, just because I think the English legal system is seen as quite cheap and quite fair. So even if you sign international contracts, odds are that they actually still might be under English law, which is, I say, great for English-based developers as well, because it's A, very convenient for you, and B, they speak your language. Quite often when people sign contracts with completely random jurisdictions, it seems fine at first, but if you get into a dispute and you're having to fly over there, or you don't speak the language, you have to hire international lawyers, it can add up, and it also affects how the whole contract gets interpreted. A good middle ground is to say, if it's not going to be where the developer is, or if it's not going to be where the publisher is, find some neutral middle ground that seems convenient for both parties and would be a sensible middle ground. But I wouldn't suggest ignoring it completely. So, bonus publishing tips. These are just some extra tips that I put on the back for publishing stuff. I kind of thought about doing this because it reminded me, do you remember when this happened late last year? There was a bit of a tiz online because essentially a developer put a post-mortem up, I think it was on Gama Sutra, about their whole kind of experience developing a game, and then they kind of went in hard on their publisher at the end, to the point then the publisher also then posted their own blog, and it kind of ended up in a bit of a Twitter war. I think this particular headline it was quite inflammatory. So really important to work out what your needs are versus your wants are for publishing deals, because as I said, these things can have so many moving parts. You need to work out exactly what you need well in advance of even going and trying to find a publisher. Work out what your costs are. As I said earlier, I've harped on about it, but cash flow is super important. Sit down and work out what your costs are for any given month, and try and work out if you think that's going to radically change over the coming, give it a year or so, or even the whole development cycle if you can. Again, a horribly boring thing to do, but when if you're going and asking for money, you really need to know what kind of money you need. And they may even ask for proof of that. They say, okay, you're going to need 3 contractors, an audio designer, and 3 artists. Show me how much that's going to cost. So have your costs all worked out before you go in. Know what you want for your game. Know how you want your game to turn out. What kind of publisher do you want? There is so much choice out there nowadays. It can be really difficult to kind of filter through everything. But given that there are a lot of smaller UK-based publishers, but also very big ones here, really think about what kind of relationship you want. Are you happy to kind of work with a massive organisation where you might just be one of many, many developers they're working with, and you might not get such a personal relationship, but you might get major marketing backing off the back of it. That might suit you. On the other hand, you might want a more personal relationship with a very specialist publisher. Paradox is a good example. Like, they do very specific, management, RPG, strategy games, predominantly for PC, but also much broader as well. So that might really suit your game. Speak to other devs, and by speak to other devs, I don't mean speak to every other dev that's had a really great hit all the time. Try and speak to devs that maybe have had games that haven't gone so well, because it speaks volumes about the publisher, how they deal with that. Obviously, as I said, everything's great when it's going well, but it's also good to get both sides of the story. A publisher might be great when a game's really successful, but when it goes sour and the publisher's a complete nightmare, that's probably not something that you want to get involved with. Final point is, even, do you need a publisher? I know that seems a bit controversial given that I've talked about publishing agreements this whole time, but given the amount of alternative sources out there right now, it's becoming a lot more, I wouldn't say easy, but there are different paths to get your game published now. So crowdfunding, like Kickstarters, grants, there's the UK Games Fund that is increasingly being used by UK-based developers, which is great. Distribution, obviously things like Steam, Greenlight, although it's not called Steam Greenlight anymore, means you can go straight to platforms. I think it's even easier now to just email Sony and get dev kits straight off them and try and worm your way through that way. And if you're stuff like the last one, PR and marketing agencies, maybe you already know where your game is going to go and how you're going to get it on there, but you just need someone to give you a bit of a PR or marketing oomph. So it might just be worth your money, spending it elsewhere. So that's everything from me. If you have any questions, that's my email, that's my Twitter account. That's great. Thank you.